And that's when I realized the model needed a behavioral layer, not just predictive inputs. My stomach dropped straight through the floor. Every word. Every single word. I sat halfway down the conference table, my fingers frozen around my pen, completely still, as my manager Neil Forsyth stood at the front of the room. Calm, polished, comfortable in a way that only comes from rehearsal. He was presenting my work like he had lived inside it, like he had been the one who stayed until midnight refining the logic, like he had been the one who filled 3 notebooks with trial models that didn't work before finding the one that did. The slides behind him were mine. The phrasing was mine. The structure, the sequence, the specific vocabulary I had spent months developing to explain a complex idea in plain language, all mine. Even the deliberate pause he took right before the conclusion. I had built that pause into the pitch myself, because I knew that a room full of executives needed a breath before the final number landed. 3 years of my life stood at the front of that room and spoke in someone else's voice. And not one person in that room even glanced in my direction. I was furniture, background, a name on no slide. I sat there with my pen in my hand, and I did not move, because the moment you react is the moment you lose control of the room, and right then, control was the only thing I had. My name is Lucas Bennett, Senior Data Strategist at Vuren Group, a mid-size analytics and investment advisory firm that had been trying for years to differentiate itself in the crowded market. I had been with the company for 4 years total, 3 of which I had spent building something I believed could genuinely change how the firm operated and how it presented its value to the outside world. The project was called the Meridian Framework. I had given it that name privately, in my own notes, though the company had later adopted it officially without anyone asking where the name came from. It was a behavioral prediction model layered on top of standard financial analytics, designed to capture not just what the data showed, but why certain patterns emerged and what they suggested about future decision-making at the organizational level. It was, as far as I knew, the only model of its kind being used in our industry at that scale. I did not interrupt Neil when he spoke my words at the front of that conference room. I did not stand up. I did not look around the table to see whether anyone else found anything strange about what was happening. I stayed completely still and let him finish the sentence he had started, because I understood something that Neil apparently did not. The truth does not need your help to surface. It just needs time in the right room. And I had spent 3 months making sure that when this particular room arrived, I would be ready for it. And this framework, Neil continued, his voice smooth and well-paced, is something I have personally refined over the last several development cycles, working closely with. Sorry. The word came from the far end of the table. Not loud, not sharp, just clear. The kind of word that lands with weight because the person saying it is not someone who uses words carelessly. Every head in the room turned toward the source. I turned too, though I already knew who had spoken. I had been watching him from the corner of my eye since the moment he sat down. His name was Arthur Pelham. He was a senior partner of Pelham Capital, one of 3 external investor groups present for what Vuren Group had billed as a strategic alignment session. Arthur was in his early 60s, lean, with a patient expression of someone who had sat through 1,000 presentations and developed an accurate instinct for which ones were real. He leaned forward very slightly. "I might be mistaken," he said, with the careful tone of a man who was fairly certain he was not mistaken at all. "But wasn't this framework developed by someone named Lucas Bennett?" The air in that room changed. Not loudly, not with any visible drama, but completely, the way a room changes when a window is opened in winter. Neil's smile appeared half a second too quickly. "I oversee the team responsible," he said. But that was not what Arthur had asked. And for the first time since I had walked into that conference room 40 minutes earlier, someone turned away from Neil Forsyth and looked directly at me. It did not start with betrayal. I want to be clear about that, because a story is easier to understand if you know how it actually began. It began with genuine enthusiasm on my part, and what felt at the time like genuine support on his. I joined Vuren Group as a mid-level data analyst 3 months before I developed the first version of what would eventually become the Meridian Framework. I was 28 years old. I had a graduate degree in behavioral economics and 3 years of prior experience at a smaller firm, and I came to Vuren with a specific idea I had been developing privately for over a year. The idea was simple in concept and enormously complex in execution. Standard financial models told you what was happening. I wanted to build something that told you why it was happening and, more importantly, what the people inside those numbers were likely to do next. Nobody asked me to build it. That is important. I saw a gap, and I moved toward it. Late nights in the office when the floor was quiet, and the building smelled like cooling coffee and recycled air. Weekends at my kitchen table with 3 windows open on my laptop and a notepad filling up with diagrams that mostly didn't work. I was not building something for credit. I was building something because it needed to exist, and I was a person who could see that clearly enough to try. When it started to take shape, I brought it to Neil Forsyth, my direct manager, because that was the right and obvious thing to do. And when I showed it to him, he smiled the way people smile when they recognize something valuable. "Let's develop this together," he said. I felt proud. I felt supported. I had no idea what those words were actually the beginning of. The first time it happened, I nearly missed it entirely. If I had not been paying attention to a specific detail, I would have filed it away as an oversight and moved on. That is exactly how these things are designed to work. They begin in the space between what you can prove and what you merely suspect. It was a Tuesday morning team update meeting. Routine. 12 people around a table, coffee cups, a projected slide deck, the usual low-energy Monday hangover atmosphere that persisted stubbornly into the middle of the week at Viren. Neil was presenting a quarterly strategy summary to the wider analytics team, and I was sitting near the back, half expecting to be called on to walk through the section that related to my model. He presented the concept, explained the logic, used the specific language I had developed to describe the behavioral layer's function, did it clearly and competently because he had read my documentation carefully enough to reproduce it accurately, and he did not mention my name once. Afterward, I told myself it was an oversight. He was summarizing broadly. Individual attribution in a team update was not always standard practice. I was still relatively new. These things take time. I gave the situation every reasonable explanation I could think of, stacked them up neatly, and settled behind them, because the alternative, that this was intentional, was an uncomfortable thing to sit with when you still had 3 years of work ahead of you and needed to believe the environment you were in was a fair one. Then came the pattern. Once you see a pattern, you cannot unsee it, and once I stopped explaining things away individually and started looking at them together, the shape became impossible to ignore. Slides I had created appeared in presentations I was not invited to. I would find out afterward, from colleagues making passing references, that a concept I had developed had been discussed in a meeting I had not been told about. Meetings I had prepared for in detail were suddenly rescheduled at the last minute with no explanation, and when I asked about rescheduling, they had already happened. Emails summarizing key decisions on the framework, the kind of correspondence that formed the official record of project development, went out from Neil's account, citing his analysis, his conclusions, his direction. Each instance was small. Each one could be explained. A scheduling conflict, an administrative shortcut, a manager taking ownership of team output in the normal way that managers sometimes do. If you looked at any single example alone, it seemed like nothing worth raising. But I was no longer looking at single examples. I was looking at the accumulation. And the accumulation told a very specific story about where my name was appearing and, more importantly, where it was being quietly and consistently removed. I was still the person doing the work. I was just no longer the person being seen doing it. The gap between those two things was widening every month, and I was watching it widen in real time without yet knowing what to do about it. I tried raising it once, carefully, without accusation, in the measured tone of someone who wants to address concern professionally and keep the relationship intact. I waited until after a team meeting where my framework's latest iteration had been presented without any mention of my role in developing it, and I knocked on Neil's open office door and asked if we could talk briefly. He welcomed me in with the easy manner of someone who had no idea what was coming, or who was very good at appearing that way. I said, as clearly and calmly as I could manage, that I had noticed my name was not being included in presentations of the framework, and that attribution mattered to me professionally. He nodded while I spoke. He had the expression of someone listening patiently to something they found mildly puzzling. When I finished, he said, "You're part of the team, Lucas. The work belongs to all of us." Then, when I tried to explain that I meant specifically the original development, the conceptual foundation that preceded the team's involvement, he tilted his head slightly and said, "You're thinking too politically." That's not a good look at this stage of your career. I left that office feeling smaller than when I walked in. That is a specific and deliberate effect of that kind of response. It takes your legitimate concern and reframes it as a character flaw. It makes you feel that raising the issue was a mistake, not the thing that caused you to raise it. I stopped pushing, but I did not stop watching. And watching, I was beginning to understand, was a more useful skill anyway. The model kept growing. That was the complicated part of all of this. Even as my visibility shrank, the work itself kept expanding in scope and significance. What had started as a personal project, a theoretical framework I had built on my own initiative, had moved through proof of concept into active testing, then into formal adoption as a strategic tool, and finally into the foundation of a significant portion of Vera Group's external pitch to investor partners. Every time the framework moved up a level within the company, I moved further out of the frame. When it was a small internal experiment, I was a person explaining it to everyone who asked. When it became a team project, I became one contributor among several, even though the core architecture had not changed and was still entirely mine. When it became company strategy, Neil was the one presenting it to leadership. And when it became the centerpiece of a major investor alignment session, I was not even on the original attendance list. I found that out by accident, when a calendar invite went around and my name was absent. I mentioned it to Neil and he said, "I wasn't sure you needed to be there," in the tone of someone making an administrative decision rather than systematically erasing someone from their own wake. I pushed back and he added me. But the fact that I had to push to attend a presentation of my own 3 years of work told me everything I needed to know about how completely the ownership of this framework had been transferred in his mind. The moment I knew with absolute certainty, the moment I stopped questioning my own read of the situation and accepted what was in front of me, came on an otherwise unremarkable Wednesday afternoon. Neil sent me a draft presentation deck by email, asking me to review it before he submitted it to the executive committee the following week. He framed it as routine. "Just check for accuracy," he said in the message. "Let me know if anything needs adjusting." I opened the file. It was my framework. My diagrams, reproduced exactly. My language, in several sections lifted almost word for word from documents I had written and shared with him over the past 2.5 years. The 3-phase deployment model I had spent 6 weeks refining was as a central slide, formatted slightly differently but structurally identical. In the bottom corner of the title slide, in small clean text, were the words, "Prepared by Neil Forsyth, Senior Strategy Director." My name was not anywhere in that document, not in the title, not in the footnotes, not in the acknowledgments section that listed 3 junior analysts who had helped format the appendix. I read through the entire deck twice looking for my name, and found it nowhere. I sat at my desk for a long time after that, not moving, not reacting. I did not close the file, and I did not reply to his email. I just sat with the full clarity of what I was looking at. This was not oversight. This was ownership being rewritten. And now that I knew it clearly and completely, I could decide what to do about it. I did not confront him. I thought about it carefully and decided that a direct confrontation was the least useful option available to me. A confrontation would alert him that I was aware of what was happening. It would give him time to adjust his narrative, construct a defense, and potentially frame me as a difficult employee before I had assembled anything concrete enough to counter that framing. Complaints without evidence can be buried. I had learned that already. What cannot be buried is a complete, time-stamped, verifiable record of original creation. So I started building one. I went back through every file on my personal devices and external drives, every email in my personal account that I had used for early development work, every photograph I had taken of notebook pages, every draft document with its original creation date intact. I organized them chronologically and completely. I created a master folder on a personal encrypted drive that contained the full development history of the Meridian framework from the first rough sketch 3 years earlier to the most recent version Neil was now planning to present as his own creation. I was methodical and I was patient. I did not work quickly or carelessly. Every piece of documentation I added was labeled, dated, and cross-referenced with other pieces in the record. I worked on it in the evenings and on weekends, not because I was in a hurry, but because I wanted it to be complete and A-type before I ever needed to use it. I did not know exactly when or how the moment would come. I just knew it would come, and I intended to be ready when it did. The external investor preview changed everything, though I did not fully understand that until later. 3 months before the executive presentation, Viren Group arranged a preliminary session with a small group of external investment partners who were being considered for a significant strategic partnership. The session was meant to give them an early look at the firm's analytical capabilities and the frameworks underpinning its approach. Neil was scheduled to lead the session. 2 days before it was set to take place, he called me into his office and told me that a conflict had come up and he could not attend. He needed me to go in his place. Just walk them through it, he said, sliding a printed copy of the deck across his desk. Keep it high level. Answer questions if they come up. Don't go off script. I took the deck and said I would handle it. What I did not tell him was that I had absolutely no intention of presenting that material as anything other than my own original work. When I stood in front of that room 3 days later, I introduced myself fully. Lucas Bennett, Senior Data Strategist, the developer of the Meridian Framework. I walked them through the model with the fluency and depth of someone who had lived inside every layer of it for 3 years. Because I answered every question from first principles because I understood the work from the inside out. And when the session ended, I left that room for the first time in years feeling like the framework and my name were the same thing again. One investor stayed after the session ended, and the others had begun gathering their materials and moving toward the door. He was an older man, unhurried, with a kind of quiet confidence that comes from decades of watching people and learning quickly which ones are worth paying attention to. He waited until the room had mostly cleared before he approached me. "Strong framework," he said simply, not effusively, just directly, the way people speak when they mean what they say and do not feel the need to decorate it. Remind me of something I've only seen once before, in a much earlier form. I looked at him and said, "This is the only version. I built it from scratch 3 years ago." He studied me for a moment with the expression of someone filing information carefully. "Keep your name on it," he said. Then he picked up his folder and left. His name was Arthur Pelham. I did not know that afternoon how significant that brief exchange would turn out to be. I did not know that Arthur Pelham would be seated at the far end of the executive conference table 3 months later when Neil Forsyth stood at the front of the room and presented my life's work as his own careful development. I did not know that Arthur Pelham had a memory for names and a low tolerance of dishonesty. What I knew, walking out of that building with the late afternoon light hitting the pavement, was that for the first time in a very long while, someone who mattered had heard my name attached to my wake, and it had felt like something being returned to me. 3 months passed. I kept working. I kept documenting. I kept adding to the record on my encrypted personal drive, which by now ran to over 200 files covering every stage of the framework's development. I attended team meetings and contributed to the project's continued refinement and said nothing about what I knew. I watched Neil prepare for the executive presentation with the focused energy of someone who believed they were about to have a significant professional moment, which they were, though not the kind they were planning for. The executive presentation was the final stage of Viren Group's internal strategic alignment process. It was a moment when the framework will be formally adopted at the highest level of the company, which meant it will be entered into the institutional record under whichever name appeared on the title slide. I understood what that meant. Once something is in the institutional record, removing it requires deliberate action and creates a visible disturbance. Neil understood this too, which was why he had been so careful and so patient about getting his name onto the work before this moment arrived. I prepared for the session the way I prepared for everything that mattered. Quietly, completely. I had my documentation ready on a personal drive in my bag. I had reviewed every file in the record one final time the night before to make sure I could navigate it quickly and clearly under pressure. I arrived at the conference room early, took a seat halfway down the table, opened my notebook, and waited for Neil to begin presenting the last 3 years of my professional life as his own achievement. Neil was good. I want to say that plainly because it is true and because it matters to the story. He had clearly spent significant time preparing this presentation, and he delivered it with the polish of someone who had rehearsed until the material felt natural in his mouth. He moved through the slides at the right pace. He handled the transition smoothly. He used the correct terminology in the correct context, which told me he had gone back through my documentation thoroughly enough to absorb the language even if he could not have derived the concepts independently. He made eye contact with the executive strategically. He paused at the right moments. He built the narrative the way I had built it. because it was my narrative, and I had spent considerable time making sure the logical architecture was sound enough to carry weight in exactly this kind of room. Watching someone else deliver your work competently is a specific and uncomfortable experience. There is a perverse quality to it. Part of you can even appreciate the execution, while the rest of you is quietly furious at the circumstance. He believed he had already won. I could see that in the way he carried himself at the front of the room. The outcome felt settled to him. He had brought the work this far. The presentation was a formal confirmation of something already decided. He was not watching for threats because he did not believe any existed. That confidence, I knew, was the most dangerous thing about him, and also, at this particular moment, his most significant vulnerability. I let him get through the bulk of the presentation before I spoke, not because I was hesitant, but because I understood pacing. If I had interrupted early, I would have appeared reactive. The room would have oriented itself around the disruption rather than around the content, and Neil would have had the advantage of appearing calm by comparison. I needed the room fully settled and the material fully presented before I said anything at all. He was moving into the final section, the section I had titled Strategic Deployment Pathway in my original documentation, when I leaned forward slightly and spoke. Would you mind expanding on the model's origin? My voice was measured, conversational, the tone of someone asking a genuine clarifying question rather than laying a trap, even though it was both. Neil glanced at me briefly, then returned his gaze to the wider room with the smooth confidence of someone who had an answer prepared. It was a collaborative effort, he said. The team worked extensively on developing and refining. The origin specifically, I said, the original behavioral layer concept. Where did that come from? I was not aggressive, not accusatory. I was precise, and precision, in a room full of executives trained to evaluate claims and counterclaims, is far more powerful than aggression. Neil's eyes came back to me for a fraction of a second longer this time. Then he moved on, because he had no clean answer that served him, and the room was still, mostly, his. Arthur Pelham leaned forward for the second time. He had not spoken since his initial question early in the presentation had produced Neil's carefully diplomatic non-answer about overseeing the responsible team. He had sat quietly since then, which I had noticed and which I suspected meant he was waiting rather than satisfied. "No," he said. His voice was quiet and completely certain, the voice of a man who does not raise it because he has never needed to. I am fairly certain I heard this framework described directly by Lucas. He did not add qualifications, did not say "I think" or "it seemed like." He said he was fairly certain, and in Arthur Pelham's vocabulary, I was already beginning to understand. Fairly certain meant he had no doubt whatsoever. He did not look at Neil when he said it. He looked at me. And because Arthur Pelham was a senior partner at one of the 3 investment groups in that room, and because every executive at that table had a finely tuned instinct for which voice carried the most weight in any given moment, the entire room followed his gaze. Every head turned. All of them, including people who had sat in dozens of meetings with me over the past 3 years without once asking me to explain my own thinking, were suddenly looking at me with full and careful attention. Neil's expression did not collapse. He was too disciplined for that. But something in it shifted, a tightening, a slight recalculation behind the eyes, that told me he was no longer as comfortable as he had been 30 seconds ago. The shift in the room was not dramatic. Nobody gasped. Nobody stood up or raised their voice. There was no visible confrontation. What happened was subtler and more significant than any of those things. The gravitational center of the room moved. That is the only way I know how to describe it. One moment Neil Forsyth was a clear focal point of every person at that table, the presenter, the authority, the source. The next moment, he was one of several people in the room, and the most important question was no longer what he was saying but what I was about to say. I watched it happen with the specific calm of someone who has spent months preparing for a moment and can now see it arriving exactly as anticipated. Neil's posture had tightened by a degree that most people would not have noticed. His weight had shifted back very slightly, the physical equivalent of recalibrating. The executives were still oriented toward the front of the room, but their attention was divided now, split between the man standing at the screen and the man sitting halfway down the table who an investor had just named unprompted with quiet certainty. The presentation had not been derailed. It was still technically ongoing. Neil still had the clicker in his hand, and the screen behind him still showed my slides. But the authority of the room had redistributed in the space of about 15 seconds, and everyone at that table could feel it even if nobody was saying it out loud yet. I took a slow breath, kept my hands flat on the table, and waited another moment before I spoke again. I stood up, not quickly, not with any theatrical quality. I pushed my chair back and rose at the pace of someone who has made a considered decision and is carrying it out. The room watched me. Neil watched me. Arthur Pelham watched me with the focused calm of someone who already knows the shape of what is coming and is prepared to confirm it. I can clarify, I said. My voice was level. I built the original framework 3 years ago, before it was a team project, before it was a company strategy, before it had a name anyone else had heard. I built the first version of the behavioral layer model independently, in the months before it was ever presented internally. I paused for one beat, and I have the full development history with me. Silence, not the hostile silence of a room in shock, the processing silence of a room reassembling its understanding of what it is looking at. I could see the executives recalibrating, reconsidering the last 40 minutes through a different lens. The framework had not changed. The slides on the screen had not changed. But the story of where it came from had just been directly and specifically contradicted by someone who had been sitting quietly in the room the entire time, and who had just stated a counterclaim in front of an investor who appeared ready to support it. I connected the drive to the laptop port in front of me, and the room's secondary screen populated with a file directory. Clean, organized, labeled with dates going back 37 months. I did not rush through it. I navigated to the original framework document, the first version, created on a Tuesday evening 3 years and 2 months before this meeting, and I opened it. The formatting was rougher than the polished deck currently on the main screen. The language was still being developed, but the core structure, the behavioral prediction layer, the 3-phase deployment sequence, the specific integration logic that made the model work, was all there, intact, dated, mine. I walked the room through the version history without accusation and without emotion. I showed them the evolution from rough draft to refined system across 14 distinct versions, each one time-stamped, each one saved in a way that established clear and unbroken authorship. I showed them the email record from the early development period, messages I had sent to myself from a personal account as a documentation habit, describing the framework's progress in my own words at each stage. I showed them the original diagrams drawn on a tablet application that preserved creation metadata. I did not say Neil had stolen anything. I did not need to. The record spoke in a language that required no interpretation. Dates do not have opinions. Version histories do not exaggerate. What I laid in front of that room was not an argument. It was an archive. And an archive is the most honest witness available to anyone in any room. And for additional context, I said, keeping my voice at the same even register I had maintained throughout, this framework was also presented to an external investor group last quarter. In that session, I was a presenter. I introduced the material under my name and walked the group through the full model. I turned my head and looked directly at Arthur Pelham. You were in that room. Arthur Pelham nodded once. A single, unhurried nod. No elaboration. No supporting speech. Just confirmation, delivered with the quiet authority of a man whose word in this particular setting carried the weight of a signed document. That nod did more work in 2 seconds than anything I could have said in 5 minutes. It placed an independent, credible, external witness in the center of the record. It confirmed that my claim was not a sudden reaction to today's slight, but a consistent truth that had been observed and remembered by someone with no stake in the internal politics of Viren Group. Neil had not moved from the front of the room. He was still standing beside the screen, the clicker still in his hand, his expression composed in the specific way of someone maintaining composure through significant effort. The room was no longer paying attention to the screen. Every executive at the table was looking between me, the file directory on the secondary screen, and Arthur Pelham, triangulating, assembling, arriving, one by one, at the only conclusion the available evidence supported. Neil tried to speak. I watched him make the decision to try, and I watched him work through the opening of a sentence, and then I watched him stop. Not because anyone interrupted him, because he reached the point in the sentence where he would have needed to say something specific, something that could be checked against the record now sitting on the secondary screen, and he understood that anything specific would make his position worse rather than better. Let's not make this, he began, and then he stopped. The unfinished sentence hung in the room for a moment, neither retracted nor completed, which was worse than either option would have been. A finished sentence can be responded to. A half sentence that trails off tells a room that the person speaking it could not find an ending that would help them. Neil Forsyth was a capable and intelligent man who had spent 3 years carefully constructing professional narrative, and he had just run out of road. The clicker was still in his hand. The slides were still on the main screen. But nobody in that room was looking at the slides anymore, and the clicker had become a strange and useless object, a prop from performance that had changed genre without warning. He lowered his hand slowly to his side. He did not sit down. He stayed at the front of the room because sitting down would have been a visible retreat, but standing there was no longer doing him any good either. One of the senior executives, Viren Group's chief strategy officer, a precise and economical woman named Patricia Osei, who I had spoken to exactly twice in 4 years, leaned forward and addressed me directly for the first time. Her voice was neutral and careful, the voice of someone in a position of authority managing a developing situation in real time. "Lucas," she said, "can you send those records to me and to the executive team after this meeting?" "Already prepared," I replied. I had created a clean, compiled package of the complete development archive 3 weeks earlier, organized into a single compressed file with a summary document at the front. I had been carrying it on my drive since then, ready to send within minutes of being asked. Patricia Osei looked at me for a moment with an expression I could not entirely read, but that contained, I thought, a specific quality of reassessment. Then she looked at Neil at the front of the room and said, evenly and without emphasis, "Why don't we take a short break?" It was not a question. The room began to move. Chairs pushed back. People reached for phones and water glasses. The quiet sounds of a meeting being paused. Neil stepped away from the screen and moved toward the side of the room, and I watched him go with the calm of someone who has done what they needed to do and can now simply wait. I had not raised my voice once. I had shown no anger, no bitterness, no satisfaction, just readiness. And readiness, I had learned, was a thing that could not be argued with. The executive presentation did not resume. The break that Patricia Osei called never ended in the way breaks are supposed to end, with people returning to their seats and the agenda continuing. Instead, the investor group was quietly thanked for their time and escorted to a separate meeting room where refreshments and an alternate discussion were arranged. The main conference room cleared. People went back to their desks or to private calls. The formal session was over. Within 48 hours, Viren Group's HR and legal departments had initiated an internal review. I was contacted and asked to provide my full documentation, which I submitted the same afternoon in the form of the compiled archive I had already prepared. The review was conducted by an external consultant brought in specifically to avoid the appearance of internal bias, which told me that the executive team was taking the situation seriously enough to protect the company's exposure. The review took 11 days. I was interviewed once, for 2 hours, and answered every question with the same flat factual clarity I had brought to the conference room. I was not asked to characterize Neil's intentions or to make claims about what he had known or planned. I was asked to verify dates and demonstrate authorship, which I did comprehensively. On the 12th day, I received a message from Patricia Osei's office asking me to come in for a meeting the following morning. Neil Forsyth was not in the building that day. He was not in the building the day after that. He was not reassigned, and he was not placed on a performance plan. He was removed from Viren Group entirely, and the official communication to the wider team said nothing specific and everything necessary. The Meridian framework was formally reinstated under my name. Not quietly, not as a background administrative correction, but in a documented and communicated process that created a clear record of original authorship for the institutional file. Patricia Osei handled it personally, which I took as a signal that the executive team understood the seriousness of what had occurred and wanted the correction to be visible enough to be meaningful. 3 weeks after the internal review concluded, I was asked to present the framework to the executive committee. The same room, the same long table, the same chairs. I stood at the front with my own laptop connected to the display screen, and I walked through the material I had built over 3 years with the fluency and depth of someone who knew every layer of it from the inside out because they had constructed every layer themselves. I did not reference what had happened before. I did not mention Neil's name or make any allusion to the previous presentation. I simply presented the work, clearly and completely, and let it speak in a way it had always been capable of speaking when attached to the right voice. The silence in that room at the end of my presentation was different from the silence I had sat in 3 weeks earlier. I noticed it immediately. It had a different texture. It was not the cautious silence of a room that had just witnessed something unexpected. It was the settled silence of a room that had just received something it recognized as genuinely valuable. I gathered my materials at a normal pace and thanked them for their time. 6 months after that presentation, the Meridian Framework was formally adopted as a foundational strategic model for Viren Group's core service offering across all 3 of its primary client verticals. The adoption was announced internally and externally. My name was attached to it in the company's published materials for the first time, in the way that the names of people who build things worth building are supposed to be attached to those things from the beginning. I did not celebrate loudly. I went home that evening and made dinner and sat at the kitchen table where I had spent so many weekend mornings working through the framework's early problems, and I thought about the distance between those mornings and this one. It was not a triumphant feeling. It was quieter than that. More like the feeling of something being set back in its right place after a long time in the wrong one. Arthur Pelham reached out through an intermediary 2 weeks after the adoption announcement. He was not proposing anything specific. He simply wanted me to know, through his assistant's brief message, that Pelham Capital would welcome a direct conversation at whatever point made sense. He did not explain why. He did not need to. I understood what it meant for someone like Arthur Pelham to reach out after watching someone handle a difficult moment with documentation and restraint rather than noise. I replied that I would be glad to connect and suggested a time in the following month. Then I closed my laptop and went for a walk in the last of the evening light. People can take your work. They can take your voice and your moment and your name from the slides that carry your thinking. But if what you built is real, built from the inside, from genuine understanding that cannot be borrowed or rebranded, the truth eventually finds the right room and says your name out loud. All you have to do is make sure the record is ready when it does.